Welcome back to Social Psychology. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 9, Stereotypes, Prejudice, and Discrimination. And I've broken up this lecture into 3 mini lectures, so that makes it hopefully more accessible to you, easier to download, etc. So let's get started with the beginning of Chapter 9. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, so as you remember, hopefully from reading Chapter 9, the big questions were things like, why do humans stereotype and prejudice in the first place? Is it something about our environment and our culture? Is it something about us? And then really importantly, we want to end the chapter with how can we reduce stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So let's get started by making sure that we understand some common definitions that are going to be important in this chapter. The first is that we have to differentiate between what social psychology calls our in-groups versus our out-groups. And sometimes in popular culture, when we talk about an in-group, we're talking about like a group of cool kids or popular kids in school, and that's not what this is referring to. So in social psychology, an in-group is any group in which you are a member. So for my students, it's being a student at BVU, at Buena Vista University. That's an in-group for you. Other students at BVU are in your in-group. It could be your hobbies. So let's say you like to go to Comic-Con like I do. You like to watch the Marvel and the DC movies, and so you're kind of like a Comic-Con nerd. So that would be your in-group, other people who like those movies, who go to Comic-Con, etc. It could be your sexual orientation, your religion, your ethnicity, anything that makes you have a social group are your in-groups. And so an out-group is simply people who are not in your group. So people who go to other schools, people who are in a different religion, people of other sexual orientations, etc. Okay, we also want to differentiate among stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So in social psychology, a stereotype is a belief about a group of people or people because they're in a certain group. So for example, let's say that you believe that women are emotional and that they use their emotions to make decisions instead of logic like a man might. So you're describing the group, that's a stereotype. Prejudice is when it becomes an emotional judgment or an evaluation. So you say that women are basically not as good as leaders. You're judging them to be less competent as leaders because you think that they're too emotional. Now you have a prejudice. You have an evaluation or a judgment. Discrimination is when that turns into an action. So let's say that you are less likely to vote for a female candidate for president because of your stereotypes and your prejudice. So that action of being less likely to vote for a female candidate is discrimination. So stereotypes are beliefs, prejudice is evaluations or judgments, and discrimination is behaviors. Okay, so that said, now that we have a vocabulary foundation, one of the big questions that social psychology has tried to answer when it comes to stereotypes and prejudice is, why do we do it? When we look at historical documents, when we look at current cultures all around the world, it seems like every human culture has stereotypes and prejudice. So why is it such a universal, ubiquitous tendency for humans to group people, to label people, to have these stereotypes, and then have these accompanying judgments? So in this class, we're going to talk about 7 ideas from social psychology. In the first mini lecture, we'll just cover the first 3, and then in the second mini lecture, we'll cover the second half. But basically, what I want you to think about is, do you think that these ideas cover everything? And it's not like one idea is going to turn out to be right and the others are going to be wrong. I think these are all right in a way. They combine to explain all the stereotypes and prejudice that we have. So some might be more applicable in some contexts, to some people, to some stereotypes and prejudice, but we need all 7 of these ideas to really understand the full picture of why we have stereotypes and prejudice. So let's think about each idea in turn. Okay, idea number 1 is called the kernel of truth. And this one is a little bit controversial. It can make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. But the idea is that the stereotype had to start from somewhere. At some point in history, even if it was a single person from 1,000 years ago, the stereotype was born because a little tiny piece of it was a little bit true. So examples of this: people who wear glasses are smart. This stereotype probably comes from the fact that we consider people who are well-read to be more intelligent. And so if you're more educated, we think of you as more intelligent. But if you've done all that reading, that's actually kind of bad for your eyes. And so you probably will need to get glasses sooner rather than later. So we think that wearing glasses equals reading a lot, and that equals being smart. The idea that women are not as educated as men, that comes from the fact that for years and years, many cultures made it illegal or impossible for women to go to school as much as men could. So sure, women are less educated, but that's because they haven't been given the opportunity. Same idea for the last example on this slide, the stereotype in the United States that Black people can't swim. This is actually a stereotype that I didn't hear until I got to college, but it turns out that this is a common stereotype in the United States. And the idea for kernel of truth is that some African Americans don't have the opportunity to go to a pool as a luxury thing in the summer because, as one of my students said last year, there aren't pools in the ghetto. Now, it's a stereotype that Black people even live in the ghetto, right? There are certainly lots of affluent, high status people who are African American in our culture, but the stereotype is that African Americans live in urban areas and they don't have as much access. It's also true that in the United States for years and years, the pools have laws saying Black people aren't even allowed. So the idea was, again, that we didn't have the same opportunity. So it might be true now that there are fewer African Americans who know how to swim because they weren't given the opportunity that other races got. The last example on here is the stereotype that Jewish people have money and are good at business. This comes from historical laws in places like ancient Rome that said Jewish people aren't allowed to own land and Christians aren't allowed to be money lenders. So that's basically an old-fashioned word for you're not allowed to own a bank. You're not allowed to give people money as a loan and then charge interest if you're Christian. So what happens is Jewish people can't own land, so they turn to business and banking. Christians can't be money lenders, but they can't own land, so they become farmers. But if they want to get a loan, they have to go to someone who's Jewish. So it's these laws, it's these opportunities, these historic prejudices that create stereotypes, and it's kind of a chicken and egg problem, which came first. The kernel of truth is simply the idea that at some point historically, this started probably because of racism, homophobia, sexism, and that we still have that legacy in our culture today. The next idea is adaptive categorization. And this is really kind of an evolutionary idea. So this theory is that humans have evolved an instinct to group and label people as quickly and efficiently as possible. The idea is that we want to survive. We want to be able to immediately assess threats in our environment. So we've created stereotypes and prejudice so that we can immediately see someone, and based purely on their physical characteristics, we can judge them as being a threat or not a threat. And the reason that we use physical characteristics is because that's the first information we get about someone. So just by looking at you, I can guess your basic age, I can guess your basic race, I can guess your socioeconomic status, I can guess your sex or your gender. And that's a lot of information that I can now make assumptions about the type of person you are, whether you're going to be my ally or my enemy. So the idea is that we do this because it's an adaptive or evolutionary advantage instinct. Another term that we've used before in class is cognitive misers. So this is the idea that we want to use as little thought as possible to make decisions. We're kind of lazy when it comes to making decisions. So we can fall back on these labels and these stereotypes and decide, I want to be friends with you, or I don't want to be friends with you, based purely on my stereotype, and it's just easier. It's a way to be lazy when we make decisions. One idea is that this instinct is so strong, this us versus them instinct is so strong that it's become automatic and instinctive, even when the group is meaningless. So let me talk a little bit more about that idea on the next slide. So there was a researcher named Taj Fell who wanted to point out that our instinct to group people and then to favor our own group, our in-group, is so strong that we do this automatically and when a group is meaningless. So he set up an experimental design called the minimal group paradigm. The word paradigm means a system or structure. So he brings participants into his lab. Remember that P's is participants, and he has, these are actually young, like middle school, high school age boys. He brings them into his lab and he has them look at a screen with a bunch of dots on it, and he says, estimate how many dots are on the screen. And then based on whatever they say, he actually randomly assigns them to be in either a group that he calls the underestimators or the overestimators. So this is what we call bogus feedback. They're not actually overestimators or over or underestimators. He's just telling them that they're in one group or the other so that it can be via random assignment. And that way, the groups are actually formed randomly and they're not meaningful in any other way. He then has them get the opportunity to assign money or points to their own group versus the other group. And he finds, of course, that the participants are biased to give more money or points or resources to their own group. So he talks about this research in scientific settings, and people say, well, I don't know if you really have found evidence for adaptive categorization just based on this single study. So we need replication. Again, we've talked all semester about how replication is important. So he does this whole study again, but instead of using over or underestimators, he now uses paintings. So he brings in a similar type of population. Again, it's middle school, high school boys, and he asks them, which artist do you prefer? Do you prefer Klee or Kandinsky? So here on the slide, you can see examples of some paintings by Klee. So take a look at those. Do you kind of like these paintings? Do they speak to you? And here we have paintings by another artist named Kandinsky. These are real artists and real paintings. So he has the boys come in, they choose which artist they prefer. And again, he does the same sort of procedure where he has them identify in their group, and then they can distribute resources. And again, we see the bias that people give their own group more resources. Okay, so that's established 2 times now. He does it a 3rd time where he has the boys come in, and instead of grouping themselves into over or underestimators or which artist do you prefer, he now does it explicitly randomly. So he brings in each boy and he basically absolutely says, you are going to be put in a group randomly. He explains it to them. They know it's random. He puts them into group A versus group B. And he asks them now, again, distribute resources between the 2 groups, and people still distribute the resources in a biased way so that their own group gets more resources. So now he's done this 3 times using 3 different kinds of groups, and he decides this is really pretty good evidence that we prefer our own groups, even when the groups don't mean anything. Even though we know the group is random, we still have this basic instinct to protect our own group. That makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. We want to protect ourselves, and that means we want to protect our groups. So that's the idea of adaptive categorization, the idea that these categories are adaptive or evolutionarily beneficial to us. The 3rd idea that we'll discuss, the last one in this particular mini lecture, is social identity theory. Social identity theory, we actually talked about in an earlier chapter, but it's the idea that our self-concept and our self-esteem is partially based on our group memberships. So of course we want to maintain a positive view of our in-groups because that reflects better on us. So we talked about this last time with verging or basking in reflected glory, where you wear your team's uniform or your team's colors or your school's colors. If a sporting event has gone well for you, you try to kind of glom onto that success. So another way that we can study this with prejudice and discrimination is that when something happens in our in-group that goes well, we can make an internal attribution. So if we are the BVU students and the BVU team has a sporting event and they win, we can say that the reason that they won is because of something internal about them. They're talented, they worked really hard. They basically deserved to win. But at the same time, if our in-group does badly, if the BVU team goes out there and loses, we'll make an excuse for why they lost that's external to them, an external attribution. So we'll say it's not fair that they lost, the refs were biased against them, the other team cheated, the other team had a home field advantage, we had to travel and they didn't, so they were rested. Somebody on our team was sick, we got bad news from our coach. Something about the circumstances made us lose. So that protects our positive view of our in-group. Of course, we have the opposite bias when we're making attributions for the out-group. If the out-group succeeds, we make an external attribution. They don't really deserve the credit because there was something about the situation that caused them to win. And when the out-group loses, we make an internal attribution. We say, yeah, of course they lost because they're a bunch of losers. So we have this bias in how we think about our in-group versus out-group, and that maintains the stereotype that our group is better than the other group. Another part of social identity theory is what we call in-group heterogeneity and out-group homogeneity. So the idea is that you mostly hang out with people who are pretty similar to yourself. They're about the same age as you. They might have similar socioeconomic status as you. They might even be the same race or gender as you. We generally hang out with people who are similar to ourselves. So that results in in-group heterogeneity is the idea that you can see the diversity within your in-groups because you're hanging out with a lot of people in your in-group and you can see that they are not all the same. So if we think about BVU students as your in-group, you see the diversity among BVU students. But when it comes to your out-group, you're not hanging out with them. You don't know them as well. And so you tend to just maintain a stereotype because you don't know any different. So if I said Harvard students is an out-group, we have a stereotype that Harvard students might be rich, they might be kind of prissy or stuck up, right? And we don't really have any other information about the out-group because we don't know them as well. So we maintain the idea that they're all the same. That's that homogeneity, homo meaning same, right? So they're all the same, whereas we can see the diversity of our own in-group. So this maintains the stereotype about the out-group that they're all alike because we don't know any differently. Okay, so there are actually 8 theories. I just realized that I forgot to change the number on this one. So there are going to be 4 theories in this first mini chapter and first mini lecture and 4 theories in the second. So theory number 4, and then I'll fix the numbers in the next mini lecture, is social learning theory. Okay, so this should have a number 4 on the top. So social learning theory is the idea that we maintain stereotypes and prejudice because we pass it on from one generation to the next. Okay, so social learning theory is you learn your culture's stereotypes and prejudice through social agents, which are people who send this message on to the next generation. So that's going to be your parents, probably taught you some stereotypes and prejudice without really realizing it. Your teachers, certainly mass media, popular culture passes on stereotypes and prejudice, and your peers. So social agents are the people who pass that information on to the next generation. Okay, an example that I'm going to point out for social learning is gendered ideas of what little boys and little girls are supposed to be like. And an example of how we do this in our culture is through toys. So we can see that certain toys are marketed toward girls, things like an easy bake oven, right? That the marketing of that is going to usually be girls, and things that are like pink and have flowers. And boys get toys that are more like trucks, or building things that are more active, things that are more scientific in nature, basically. So from an early age, boys and girls learn what is expected of their culture. A more modern example of this that I see when I go shopping is Legos. So Lego packages, I love Legos, don't get me wrong, but Lego packages will often have colors that cue you whether this is supposed to be a boy Lego set or a girl Lego set. So this one you can see is blue. It's definitely got a lot of like masculinity to it, as opposed to something like this, which is sort of pink and purple. It's got drawings of girls in the background. They're all smiling and pretty, and they have long hair. And the idea is that the franchise of Legos for girls is called Lego Friends, and it has a little butterfly on the logo. Okay, so I get that Lego wants to make money, right? But what annoys me about this is if you look at the two packages next to each other, the regular Legos, or what I would call boy Legos, if you look at the age group, 6 to 12, how many pieces are in the boy Lego set? 748. If you look at the Legos for girls, same exact age group, and it's only 230 pieces. So to me, this is sending this sort of implicit cultural message that Legos for girls have to be less complicated. They're bigger pieces. You don't put the little things together as much. It's not as complicated. So it's basically kind of dumbed down Legos for girls. So this is just one example. Maybe you don't agree with me about this example, but I think that we can all see these messages that our culture sends us about gendered expectations, about racial expectations, about socio-class economic expectations. And so the idea is that we learn stereotypes and prejudice from one generation to the next through this social learning, through hearing the messages of older people of our culture. Okay, so that was it. I'm gonna go on to the next mini lecture, which is gonna cover the next 4 ideas from social psychology. Thanks very much, and as always, let me know if you have questions.